you made a link sort of between liberalism and communism, and even the liberalism that sort of comes out of the English Civil Wars. I don't think most people get that connection, because that's one thing I'll admit. I even was kind of clueless. So I really appreciated that part of your article. So I was like, oh wow, that's a great insight. I didn't know about it either.
Another myth. It's simply a myth called the state of nature. And he said the solution to all these civil wars was this Leviathan government, which he saw personified really in Oliver Cromwell, who we know massacred many Catholics, a terrible human being. But as you said, it's very crucial we couple the spiritual life with our Catholic political life. You cannot have one without the other.
Our Lady was clearly drawing our attention to communism.
Russia has been chosen as an instrument, either of chastisement or of mercy. That is, only the Blessed Virgin can help us.
Praise be Jesus and Mary. I'm David Rodriguez, Content Director for the Fatima Center, and today I am joined by Murray Rundus. Murray, welcome.
Yeah, great to be on. Should be a great show.
It's great to have you. This is the first time I've gotten to interview, so thank you for coming on. And for those of you who may not know, Murray is a former Disney Channel and Broadway actor who converted to Catholicism in 2018. We probably don't get too many of those. But he currently also serves as the production manager and editor for Catholic Family News. I think if some of you know him, that's probably where you know him from. He co-hosts the weekly news roundup with Dr. Brian McCall, another good friend of the Fatima Center. And in particular, I wanted to ask Murray to come on because in the latest issue of the Fatima Crusader, this is issue 133, our fall 2024 edition, it deals with communism. Many of you may have been watching certain videos by Father Stalen on our website, articles that we're posting. Well, the Crusader deals into that as well. And we've gotten some real favorable remarks on it. People are very grateful. They think it's timely and needed, and they're spreading it among their friends. So we're grateful to that. But Murray is one of the authors. In particular, you tackled, I'm going to turn to that page, you tackled this topic of basically the Red Leviathan, and you titled it Communism and a Myth of Modernity. And part of the concept here is that one of the, if you will, telltale signs, I guess, of communism is that it creates really big government, right? And so I guess my questions to you, Murray, if I can just start off to let people know maybe just a little bit about your own article and what you wrote there. It does seem that at least today, we just had elections also, so maybe not quite as much, but it does seem that communism or big government appeals to a lot of people. There's a following, and it certainly seems to be resurging today, I think, in our own nation. Why do you think that is? Even why communism or big government appeals to people?
Yeah, David, I think it's important that we understand what the communists are talking about, because oftentimes they confuse everybody with these unknown, obscure, arcane words, and everybody sort of just says, well, that person looks like he knows what he's talking about. But socialism is really the umbrella that communism is under. And socialism is the system where the government, the state, owns all of the means of production. So the means of making things in the country, generating what we would think of as wealth, generating goods. And communism under that is the ideal belief or the system where there is a classless, stateless, and moneyless society. And so some of the audience might be saying, well, goodness, how then why have all these big communist governments been so big? Well, the answer is because all of these big communistic governments are using the state as an apparatus to achieve this ideal society where there's no state, there's no government. And so a lot of these communists are under this impression that the big government, the big state, is going to usher in this utopia where there is no state, there is no money, and there are no classes. And in terms of why that might be appealing to people, I think if we look back in history, we can certainly see, and the church has even recognized, that there were excesses in capitalism, things that the Catholic Church would certainly frown on. There was definitely an exploitation of workers, exploitation of many of the lower classes, and the communists did critique that. But they go wrong in saying that their alternative, which is frankly just absurd and it's godless and has many terrible consequences, that's the only alternative to the extremes of absolute laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, and what I think it's certainly ironic as a student of history if you look at it. Every time that communism has taken control of a state, of an area, all those abuses that you mentioned that might have gotten people on board with why they might have been enthusiastic about this proposed idealistic project, this mirage in the sand that disappears, the situation actually grew worse. More
Mhm.
people were in a even in a worse situation, and the situation was more pitiable, more devastating, more impoverished than it had been before. So I guess is it I like to draw the parallel of saying it's just a false promise, right? It's kind of even like the old serpent in the garden. You make this promise that may sound good, and in the end you don't deliver, and your situation is far, far worse than it ever could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the fundamental part of it, it really is naive because it really does reject fundamental human nature. How could you have this classless society without envy? And everybody knows that a part of our nature, we all commit different sins. We can know the truth, we can know what is good, but we can still act against it. And so, such a state is simply impossible. And a good short read on this to understand how such a system would just surely collapse is a book by another socialist, George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm, right? And you have it's where it just completely collapses over time because hierarchies naturally form. Man is a social creature. We naturally want to form hierarchies. And when people get entrusted to that big government position, even though they're supposed to usher in the evolution of man, usher in this utopia, people will abuse that power. And so you're right, it's a complete false promise.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to recognize there, like you say, because ultimately, when you have this state that controls everything, classless, moneyless, all that stuff, there's still a state that's sort of, handing out the soup in the soup line, etc. And the state is not a monolithic, identityless thing. That there's actually people who have to run the government. There's
Right.
guys in charge. There's the Stalin, there's the Mao, there's the Fidel Castro. There are guys who are going to run it, and they profit massively off the
Mm.
people. And so they and their friends, will just consume all the goods of the society and impoverish the rest. Orwell, I think, is interesting too that you mentioned him because he was, again, one of these fellows who was taken with communism and actually went to fight in the Spanish Revolution. That's also
Mhm.
something that's been really misunderstood. The good guys really were Franco and the nationalists who were trying to
Mhm.
restore order and Catholicism, and the bad guys were the so called Republicans who were being funded by the communists, but they got a good propaganda machine behind them. Orwell goes and fights as one of the communists. And he actually gets really turned off by the whole thing because communists start infighting with each other, which is often what happens, right? They eat their own. It's like even the devils in hell fight against each other. And so they eat their own. And so he was a little disillusioned. He understood, I think, better what at least Stalin was about. And so he models his, while he still remains a socialist, communist, he doesn't like Stalin's particular flavor, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that infighting is so important because even though these people are very sophisticated, they have all of these different works and orthodox Marxism, they call it, large schools that talk about it. There are still things that they have absolutely no clue about how to usher in real communism. Marx didn't even know how to really get to the point of that classless society. It was Lenin who had to go and establish something what he called vanguardism, which was this overthrowing the government in that massive Russian Revolution, and then using the what he called the proletariat, the uprising classes, to get rid of the capitalistic system and sort of, I mean, really brainwash people to prepare them for that communistic society. But look, if we look at the Soviet Union, constant assassinations and purges because at the end of the day, it is a big government, and whoever is at the top, what he says goes, and so it's destined to fail.
Um, so looking at this Leviathan government, I think people have a hard time thinking that maybe we're becoming communistic in the West, in the United States. But certainly, I think if you just sort of maybe rephrase it and say, well, having this really, really big government that is involved in everything you do, I think we're all sort of feeling it. I remember my grandfather talking about, he just had his land and he could build. I mean, if he wanted to add a second story onto his house, he wanted to put up a shed, he wanted to dig a well. I mean, it was his land, it was his property. He just went and did it and nobody thought anything of it, right? But now, I mean, it's like you try to sneeze on your property and you need some kind of regulation. And some guy wrote a book recently talking about how just like every single one of us is violating no less than 3 federal laws every day, and everything that we do in our normal jobs. There's just so many regulations, many of them even mutually contradictory, that no matter what you do, it's like so we've got this real big government going on. And I just wonder, do you at least see it in the thoughts, the works of our own founding fathers? Because, well, let me go back before I get there to set it up, I guess. Um, in your article, the one you wrote for the Crusader, you talked about, you made a link sort of between liberalism and communism, and even the liberalism that sort of comes out of the English Civil Wars. I don't think most people get that connection. So could you elaborate on that? Because that's one thing I'll admit, I even was kind of clueless. So I really appreciated that part of your article. So I was like, oh, wow, that's a great insight. I didn't know about it either.
I think it's very important for Catholics to understand that the forces of the devil are united in one sense, which is that they hate God and they hate Catholicism. And really, what they've done is they've set up an anti Trinity, which is this motto that they use: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And we shouldn't just see this as a slogan. These are 3 aspects where the revolution can show itself: liberty being the excess of liberty in liberalism, equality, the excess of equality in communism, and then fraternity. We've seen even in the 20th century an excess in that view of the nation, of the people, which we've seen in extreme quote unquote right wing governments that would go against the Catholic Church's teaching. But it really all started with liberalism. This is the thing that ushered in the revolution. And we could of course look back to Protestantism, where we saw a state that's growing more massive and massive as it has to take on the responsibility of the church, as Protestantism has detached itself from the Catholic Church. But in England particularly, we saw complete civil disorder. We saw the Puritans going up against the Anglo-Catholics, the Anglicans, and it was complete chaos. We had massacres. We had a large amount of deaths in this terrible civil war. And there was a man named Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was a philosopher, and he was trying to figure out, well, how in the world can this be fixed? How can we resolve massive civil disorder in a post-Catholic world? And what he comes up with is another myth. It's simply a myth called the state of nature, which is, he says, before the state came around, before any sort of government started popping up, man was in a constant state of turmoil. Everybody hated each other. Everybody was fighting. And it was the job of a gigantic government to sort of set everybody in line, put everyone in their place. And he said the solution to all these civil wars was this Leviathan government, which he saw personified really in Oliver Cromwell, who we know massacred many Catholics, a terrible human being. And that's what he saw as being the fundamentals for human rights and for the future of civilization. What communism did is it took the same premise of, well, look, God is not in the picture. The government is the one responsible for ensuring the prosperity of human civilization. But it simply looked at that myth, the state of nature myth, which can't be established. None of that's in history, that there was no government at one point. Everyone was an individual fighting for himself. Man is social by nature. So communists, they reject that, but they keep the big government in place. So they say, we have no need for the state of nature. We have no need for even saying that there are such things as human rights. They view things entirely through the lens of materialism, something that Marx called historical materialism. They look at everything in terms of class against class, person, oppressed group against oppressor. And then that's how and their solution is really the same solution, which is massive government comes in and ushers in that utopia.
Okay, so if this milieu that's sort of present in the late 1600s, the 1700s, with these ideas of equality, fraternity, and liberty that obviously give rise to the French Revolution. But as you're pointing out, they're also there in England and they're experiencing civil wars. And this is when our nation is being founded. 1776 is obviously when they signed the
Mhm.
Declaration of Independence. And the intelligent men like the Ben Franklins and the Thomas Jeffersons and the James Madisons who helped write the founding documents for this nation would have also been in that same milieu. Then do you see that this Leviathan government, as we're calling it, is it in the founding documents of this nation? Is it in the thought of the founding fathers? I mean, yes, no. How do you see that? How did
I
this our society?
Yeah, I think the founding fathers were certainly influenced by the early English Civil War thinkers, and it was really a blend between Thomas Hobbes and another man, John Locke, and they really focused on Locke, who really accepted the same myth of the state of nature, that classless, that stateless society before the Leviathan had to come in. He says that the state of nature, it did exist, but he takes a more moderate form. Locke does, and he says that God is somehow in the picture. And because Locke is a bit more moderate, I think we see some things in the American founders that we can reconcile with the Catholic Church. But because the American founders cut themselves off from the Catholic Church, established this idolatry of religious liberty, this pluralistic society, it's made it so that it's in a constant state of flux. We've seen, and in such a state of flux, the government's going to take more power. Chaos is an opportunity for the government. And we've seen that happen in multiple instances. The Articles of Confederation, which if our American audience here remembers their early American history classes, that was sort of the first constitution. And it didn't work because the government wasn't strong enough. So we saw the government strengthened in the Constitution. We saw in the Civil War, the American
Right,
Civil
and
War.
just to a real quick caveat so that we understand when you say the government strengthened, let's emphasize here we're talking about the federal government, not the
Mhm.
state governments, because we do have to make that distinguishing. The Articles of Confederation were much more empowering the states and the state
Yeah,
governments, whereas then the Constitution, which comes in 1789, gives much more power to the centralized federal government.
Yeah, and that's a great point, David, because even though subsidiarity is present in the United States, even the Constitution, you can see the origins of it. In many ways, that's why the United States is better off than some of these European countries that didn't that might have gone full blown with big state liberalism. But eventually, we saw the state's power.
If
Go
you could
ahead.
just
Sorry.
pause it there for just 1 second, because I think I was going to bring that up. I want to make sure all our audience understands that concept of subsidiarity. So it's a very, very Catholic principle, and in my view, it's certainly like an antidote to communism, because subsidiarity basically means the lowest sort of element of society, the lowest, smallest group of society that can adequately handle a job should be responsible for it. So, for example, if I, as a parent, can educate my children and educate them well, then I'm in charge of it. And the further away you get from that, whether it be a local school government or a state government or a federal, secretary of education, et cetera, very, very far removed, then they're just not going to do as effective a job. They're not going to do as good of a job, or financially as effective. It's going to get worse and worse. So you always want to keep things down to the lowest common denominator, because those people are really involved with it. They really care about it. They really understand the situation, and they're very invested in making sure a good solution comes about. And the more removed you get, the worse. So that's one of the big problems with this Leviathan government. And so hopefully you're familiar with that term, subsidiarity. It's a very important Catholic principle and really just a human nature principle. So
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt you there, Murray, but I want to make sure we get subsidiarity because it is so important. And so you were saying that we do have some subsidiarity built into our country, and that's helped us.
Yeah, it's helped us, and again, it is so important for Catholics to understand that term because I think once you understand it, you see how the federal government has taken away a lot of that original subsidiarity over time. And some of it they had a good excuse for. Slavery was, of course, a good thing to be abolished in this country. We saw unbelievable abuses there. However, we saw that used as an excuse for the federal government to be more and more empowered. In recent years, we've seen the Patriot Patriot Act, for example, used to establish a surveillance state practically over the United States. So we're moving away from some of the good elements that were present from that moderate liberalism that Locke proposed, which is still full of errors, but it's still, we're moving away from even the good that was found in various writings that those moderate liberal thinkers were thinking.
Okay, well, I think that gives people a good understanding of some of this. A little maybe current events here. What are your thoughts? I'm just here interested in knowing, like, regarding the upcoming Trump administration. I think everyone knows that if Kamala had won, she would have sort of like taken us in a hyperdrive into a much more of a communistic type state. With, like you're saying, increased surveillance, AI watchdogs. I mean, social credit scores like they have in China, the digitized currency, a lot of these things that we're worried about, right? Massive regulation, environmental regulations, certainly ease of access to abortion, euthanasia, even more open borders and crazy immigration with the rising crime that's coming with it. And then, of course, canceling out everyone who speaks against it. I was concerned about that. Even us being on these platforms where we talk about these things, suppression of our freedoms, the courts being militarized. Farrar and McCall always talk about that. Even the FBI being used almost like a KGB, like the Secret
Mhm.
Service that could just bang down your doors. So a lot of these things, I think, may have been looming before us. I mean, my own take. I'm not sure if we're out of the woods yet with the Trump administration being elected. What are your thoughts on what we might see coming up here?
Yeah, I think you're certainly right in pointing out that a Kamala Harris administration would have been terrible. I think it would have been worse than Joe Biden's administration. However, as you mentioned, the Donald Trump administration, there are still things to worry about. One of the positive things was that he did campaign, and he now has a mandate based on that campaign of being anti-censorship, and Elon Musk is going to help him with that certainly, but also anti-war. And those are two things that are often used, censorship and war, that are used to strengthen the federal government and really put the boot on the neck of the American people. And I would say I am slightly worried. I was worried initially with the pick of JD Vance. I think JD Vance in many ways has redeemed himself in some crucial aspects, especially how he's performed in the past 2 months and some of the things he's said. But many of his friends are technocrats. Many of the people he's closest with, people he's reliant on, people like Peter Thiel, these big AI, big military industrial complex people. I think that the people who voted for Donald Trump need to make it very clear we did not vote for any wars and we did not vote for any sort of censorship. If he keeps those two promises and keeps us away from foreign conflicts and foreign influence in this country, along with keeping because at the moment, look, we can't support absolute free speech. The Catholic Church doesn't accept that. That's why religious liberty is a false premise. But we have to, at this point, support our own free speech and make use of what we have, because as we know from these past 4 years, I mean, we can even look back 20 years, the Catholic Church, traditional Catholics, have had the boot on our necks by the federal government.
Well, I certainly stand with you in that hope that he will not allow us to escalate into wars, right? And that a couple of other things I hope he does. We'll see, but I'm really hoping that there is some kind of election reform. We
Mm.
desperately need it. Even just the basic voter ID. There's no reason not to have that, and not to say you must be a U.S. citizen to vote in these elections and for it to be verified. And quite frankly, I mean, my parents are immigrants. They came over to this country years ago, but what's happening in our borders, this open border policy and the crime that's come with it, is really also crazy. So I am hoping that he'll do something there, because again, I think all of those would at least slow down the on growth of communism. I think it's also very entrenched within the system that exists right now. I don't think we're going to get out of it with any human solution. Certainly, we need Our Lady of Fatima and her message. That's the only way we're going to get out of this crisis. So I think maybe by God's goodness and His grace, if things could play out in the best possible way, maybe Trump will slow it down a little. That's my hope, but we'll see. It gives us more time to do our first Saturdays. Everyone, do your first Saturdays. Pray your rosary every day to spread the message of Fatima, because that is, I do emphasize that very strongly. There is no political, economic, military solution. It's going to be a religious, it's going to be God's intervention, right? So,
Mhm. as a last note on that, I will say, for young guys in particular, we've got a lot of this vote was generated by young men and a lot of young Catholics, people enthusiastic specifically about Catholic politics. But as you said, it's very crucial we couple the spiritual life with our Catholic political life. You cannot have one without the other. And praying your rosary every day, that should be a bare minimum. That's something we can all do better on. I know it gets tough for everybody. It's late at night. You need to pray your rosary, but everyone needs to do it. It will improve your life, and it puts you in a state of growing in the spiritual life, which will help everyone. It will help the society. Young men in particular have an obligation. Pray your rosary every day.
Thank you, Murray. And again, everyone remember that Our Lady promised at one point in the end, the Pope will consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. Russia will be converted. We will have a period of peace, and her Immaculate Heart will triumph. So we've got the solution. Let's just do all we can to further that. May God bless you all. Murray, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.